Hello and welcome to the Sacred Rainbow Current Global Online Summit, bringing together the multifaceted custodians of our planet and humanity to reveal deep truths, wisdom and tools to enable the guardianship of our planet for the future generations. Sacred protection, connection and the holding of earthly and cosmic light portals is potent to humanity's highest timeline ascension. My name is Kerry Bridget McCrory and I am your summit host and creator, airing from the Valley of Coneyglen in the central Sperrin Mountains of Northern Ireland, Eru. My mountain is Spatnaduya, and my river today is the little tributaries that flow from the mountain into the burn, into the valley below. Today, I am absolutely delighted to introduce everyone in our audience to Vanessa Couto. Do you want to say hello, Vanessa?
I'm glad to be here too.
Okay. So Vanessa resides in Portland, Oregon, while her soul also feels at home in Ireland and the British Isles that Vanessa has travelled to extensively. Vanessa Couto, MA, PPC, is a life purpose coach, an astrologer, teacher, and artist. In her work, she weaves mythology, fairy tales, Jungian psychology, and a good dose of practical and grounded common sense to guide her clients at their intersection of life, purpose, and livelihood. In addition to coaching, Vanessa teaches various classes and workshops. Vanessa holds a BA in social communication and advertising from PUC MG, an MA in teaching from New York University, and an MA in counseling psychology, with an emphasis on depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. Vanessa is a professional certified coach from the International Coaching Federation. Originally from Brazil, she lives in the Pacific Northwest with her husband, their two Gemini cats, and an ever-growing collection of books, printed art, and vinyl records. So today our talk is Lessons from the Liminal Edge of Life and Death. Thank you so much for being here, Vanessa, with us today.
Thank you, Kerry.
Yeah, I'm just looking at your title here. So, Lessons from the Liminal Edge of Life and Death. What is the liminal edge? What would you say?
You know, the word liminal, I've always been sort of fascinated with this word. It's like an in-between, you know, when what was is no longer really holding, but what is coming is not yet fully arrived. So there's this territory, there's this, I feel like a sense of geography of an in-between. But actually the word itself comes from Latin, the limen, and the limen is that threshold when of a door, you know, between the inside and the outside, there's that threshold in the bottom. That's the limen. So when you cross the limen, you no longer, let's say if you're leaving your house, you're no longer on the inside, you're going to the outside, or you're leaving the outside and coming on the inside. So there's this sense of crossing a certain kind of boundary between one thing and another thing. So the liminal is a space in between, you know, what was and what is yet to be. And so this idea of life and death is the biggest, perhaps, liminal, right? When you are living and then you die, you know. So that's the biggest transition, perhaps. But in everyday life, we're going through the liminal, you know. We're going through little tiny liminal spaces. When you go to work, when you come home, you know, these transitions are always happening.
Yeah. It's like a sacred space. Like as you said, the liminal space is a sacred space. And then we're sort of like, we're bringing, if we can remember, we're in liminal spaces, in them little spaces that you're talking about.
Yeah.
How can we interact with that?
Yeah. And I think there's you know, a lot of times now we use the word transition, right? We like to use transition. You know, I'm changing, I'm transforming, and transition. But I think the word liminal has to me this kind of a poetic, soulful element to it, because to me, the liminal geography, I like to think of it in terms of a geography of a place, right? Like you live in the mountains. When you go from one place to another, the geography is changing. And I think that when we are going through a liminal phase in our lives, a bigger one, there's a sense of a geography, there is a sense of, there's a process unfolding, as opposed to sometimes a transition feels much more, I don't know, cut and dry. You know, it's a transition, boom. Or in our culture, we loved so much to be, oh, it's transformation, but we tend to focus on the end in the end and the beginning. Boom, this is it. But there's a whole aspect on the happening, these in betweens here. So that's what I'm interested in working with people through coaching or through the astrology. I can see how that sort of is the space that people go through and what comes up when they're going through it, you know.
I'm like, I'm in the liminal space now. I'm like, and it's a strange place to be because, like you say, we're so used to the beginnings and the endings, and you know, but like to even just sit, like what you're explaining about the liminal, and be in that space of not knowing, that space of in between.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it creates actually quite a lot of anxiety because of that, right? There's a sense of what used to work no longer is quite working. And then you don't know what yet is coming fully. And so there's this in between moment can create, for a lot of people, I mean, all of us, a sense of anxiety of like, what do I do? How do I engage with this, with the tools that I had? But they might not be the right tools, because what is happening is the old has to die so that the new can come in, but it's not an immediate coming in. There's this space. And I think this is where our culture likes to shorten that space, right? But there is this moment of not being suspended, right? I think in a way to be suspended. One place that I think a lot about in terms of the liminal is an airport, you know? It's an interesting, weird space to be, especially if you're traveling internationally. Once you go through the security gates, you're in this place that you can't just get out. You're waiting for your flight, and you're in this holding space. Then you get on your flight, absolutely suspended, right? And then you arrive at the other place. And then before you go through the customs and get your luggage and get out, there's this things could happen. There's no control when you're up there. You know, your flight could be delayed, things could happen. There's nothing you can do. You're just suspended. And then you arrive at another place. And then on it goes. So I often think about the liminal a little bit like when you're flying. You know, there's a sense of being suspended a little bit. This
Yeah.
limited amount of things you can do.
Yeah. And I know you've said the airport space, but for some reason it's making me think like there's like in that liminal, like that's where peace is, and that's where stillness is.
Mhm.
And that's why it's become a bit alien for us in our society. Yeah, very
Yeah.
much so. So how can we recognize the unique geography and how it shows up in our lives? And how can we, as edge dwellers, help the death and birth pangs of what we're going through in these times with?
Yeah. I think I'm thinking a lot about this. I mean, it's the season right now where, you know, moving towards winter in the northern hemisphere, and all around me, the leaves are falling and they're, you know, covering the ground. So there's I think a sense, one, I think it's important wherever you live to start noticing the shift of nature of the seasons, because the seasons themselves teach us about what is unfolding, what is dying. The leaves are falling, and they're going to go to the ground. They're going to, with time, so that their nutrients are going to go into the earth so that stuff can be born in the springtime, right? And so I think we can start observing perhaps our own geography, literal landscape around us. The weather, that's one, is space. And I think just noticing how things shift, even your own energy levels during the day, you know. Before we started recording, we were talking about like, oh, you're a morning person or an evening person, right? Even that, when you wake up, where are you? Like, how do you transition? How do you move into the day? How do you move into the sleep time? Just starting to notice your own flow helps a lot to understand, like, oh, there's a space in between. And I think what you said is really important. There's a sense of peace because there's a space and there's a pause that often we brush it aside, but that's the pause that we can start noticing. The other thing I was thinking about from a bigger perspective around the theme of your summit, right, is that when we look at the world and we look at our own countries, we can see that things are dying out, right? Some old ways of doing things are not quite fully working anymore. They're not having such a grip. Although, of course, there's always a move by some to sort of hold on to something. It's very normal in human nature. We hold on, right? So a good chunk of people are holding on. Others, perhaps through their own intuition, if you will, or ability to notice, they feel like, oh no, we're moving towards something else. Something is is finishing, is disintegrating here. We don't know exactly what's happening on the other side, but we may be more curious to move towards what might be. So I think these are the edge dwellers, folks who have a sense that the center of our culture is no longer really holding it anymore. So when the center no longer holds, there's a sense of moving towards the edges. And I think that also creates this visceral separation we're feeling in our cultures, because I feel like there's different edges. People are moving to different extremes. Those who want to hold on to an old way, and those who are like, no, 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 let's move towards something. We don't know what it is, but let's move towards it. While the center is not able to sort of contain it anymore. And I think that is also another image of what is to be on the edge, of something, moving towards something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Whenever you were explaining it, it makes a lot of sense. The only thing that I would have found a bit, for to understand is the change in the center, maybe. I don't know, is there part of me thinking that the center is, I don't know, is the center always the same? But can the center change too? But it makes great sense about what you're saying about people going to one edge and the other edge and maybe it's getting me curious about the center.
I know, that's a good point. I think I've been thinking about this, and I think this is where I don't know, I mean, this is a big philosophical question. In my mind, perhaps there's always one center, there's a source of a center, and it's just that center. But I think too, sometimes when if we think about it at an individual level, perhaps, when we go through a big transformation in our lives, something really pivotal happens, right? I do feel that when we are going through a big change, perhaps our own center of what the thing that hooked us no longer holds, and we find ourselves after the transformation, after sort of settling down, we find ourselves in a different kind of center. That's why I think people are able to really change. When you have an experience of, let's say, life and death, right? Like something really visceral like that, it can really change your worldview, right? That's why people all of a sudden go from being in such a lifestyle, moving to a very different lifestyle. And I think in that case, the center then becomes, it's a different center. They're hooking, they're attaching themselves to something different because what was before is no longer holding them anymore. They can really, like somebody with a spiritual experience, it can change their complete worldview, how they are with themselves and how they are in the world. Because I feel like perhaps now they're attaching themselves to something different. They're connecting with something different within themselves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that like we become a different center
Yeah.
ourselves, that like from what we have come through. Yeah, definitely. I'm going to change the subject a wee bit and bring in Kyron here. And for just maybe for people who don't have maybe never heard of Kyron, you could maybe give a wee explanation of Kyron and how can the myth of Kyron help us in these times now when we've to be both death and birth doulas with so much happening.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about the theme of your summit, I was thinking about the idea that, I think the folks who are going to be attracted to this theme that you're offering, and the people who are you're interviewing, in their own way, they're all edge dwellers, meaning they can see what was, and they're already guiding others towards something new in some way through their work, through that transformation. And what I was also thinking about, sort of the more collective experience of what's unfolding in the world, politically, economically, the nature, climate change, all that. We do have a sense, more and more, we're constantly talking about something is dying, right? The topic of death, like it or not, because our culture does not like death. We don't tend to talk about it, but it's there. I think at least since the pandemic, the numbers were there, right? So I think there's an element of knowing, a sense of knowing that something is dying, is finishing, is wrapping up. Now that process isn't as clean cut. It evolves in itself. It's not, you just cut it. It has to work itself through. And we can also see that new things are starting to burst. They're starting to blossom. New ideas, new ways. Think about it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a kind of summit like you're having might not have hit even it would have been really fringe. Now it's a bit more accepted, right? So we can see new things are happening. So, but I also think that when you're going through a transition, and this has to do with Chiron. So I think when you're going through a transition, a big transformation in your life, individually and collectively, because I think the collective is a reflection of our individual work. So that's why I do feel that our inner work, our inner healing is actually a civic duty, it's being a good citizen. It's not just for you because it benefits the collective. But when you're going through that, one of the key things that shows up, and this I get from working with coaching with clients, is there's the pain of something. There is, sometimes we identify ourselves. It becomes even a full part of our identity to be attached to a certain kind of pain, certain kind of trauma, which is the language of now, right? Oh, the trauma defines things, which is good to know what the trauma is, but we can see that now sometimes we identify with those elements and we stay there. And I often tell clients that the issue that they have when they're coming to coaching is actually a good thing. The issue, the pain, is saying, hey, this no longer is working. The way you kind of been coping with this is no longer working. We got to do something about this. So the pain or the issue is actually kind of saying to you, hey, Carrie, do something, let's bring it out. And if you think about this on a collective level, it's a much bigger game. And so in astrology, you know, of all the planetary archetypes, Chiron is an archetype that speaks to, it's not a planet, it's kind of an asteroid. It's caught between the orbit of Saturn and Uranus, you know, has this very weird elliptic. But the interesting thing about the myth of Chiron is that it has to do with where the wound is, and how that wound, whatever the original wound is, and for those on the Catholic side, you know, the original sin, you know, what that original pain is, that is the entry point for the healing and for the medicine. And so the interesting thing about Chiron is that because it takes a while to go around, it only comes back to its original position in your birth chart when you're about 49, 50. So it's an interesting marker developmentally. If you think about people who are 48, 49, 50, 51, this window of time is a big transformation. It's a watershed. You know, turning 50 is a big thing, right? Not that turning 40 or 60 isn't, but 50 feels, there's a heftiness to it because, you know, half a century. And it's interesting that it coincides with Chiron coming around. So what I think about Chiron, I think about and we all have it somewhere in our birth chart. So it tells us where that core wound is. And it also tells us in a way, sort of depending, because it spends a good chunk of time in certain signs. So certain generations have a certain marker that kind of gives a certain group of people that have Chiron in a certain place a signature, you know. So that's when you can see the individual wound meeting more the collective. What is our group can do for the collective? Now, the interesting thing about the myth of Chiron, and in Greek mythology, Chiron is a centaur. He's half horse, half man. So already there in this image, you see the duality, right? Half animal, half wild, half human, right? And he was the son of the god Cronus. For the Greeks, he was Cronus. For the Romans, he was Saturn, right? So we hear about Saturn with the nymph. And the story goes that Saturn was pursuing this nymph, and she, to escape him, transformed herself into a mare. And so Saturn transformed himself into a horse, and that's how they mated. And so when she gave birth to Chiron, she took back her sort of human form. And when she gave birth, she was shocked that her offspring was half horse because she was in the shape of a mare, and half human, half. And so she, in such shock, she abandoned Chiron. Saturn abandoned. So he was an abandoned child already from the word go. And it's the god Apollo, the sun, you know, the god of healing, the god of arts and music, takes Chiron and his sort of takes him in and teaches him all the arts and gives Chiron a very comprehensive education. And Chiron grows up to be a very wise centaur, very different from his other people, because there were other centaurs and they were much more wild and much more instinctual. But Chiron was sort of wise. He marries, he gets married, so he has a life, he has a sort of a home life. There's a sort of a bit of healing around that, right? And he becomes the teacher, the mentor of all the heroes. So all the heroes, from Hercules to the big ones, Theseus, they all come to train with Chiron. So he becomes a masterful teacher because he knows all these arts, because Apollo taught him everything. So he was very well respected, and he lived in the mountains. And so there was a lot of around healing that happened around the figure of Chiron. And then later in life, one of his pupils, which was Hercules, by accident, wounds Chiron with an arrow that was poisoned. And because Chiron is the son of Saturn, he's the son of a god, he can't die, he's immortal. So he gets wounded with this poison from the arrow of Hercules by accident, but he can't heal, he can't die. So he's in agony, he's in constant agony. He can't die, there's no release of death and no healing either. So with his wisdom, he tries to find all kinds of medicine to help himself. He can't cure himself, but in doing that, he finds medicine that helps others. And then eventually, Hercules, feeling so, wounded and sad that he hurt his mentor, he didn't mean to. He goes after his father Zeus and says, please, please release him, give him immortality, release him from the pain. And so Zeus releases Chiron from his pain, and Chiron becomes, he goes to the heavens, he becomes the constellation. So he's released finally. But the interesting thing I think about Chiron is that he takes on his pain that was from the abandonment as a child and makes something of it that does help others. So that's why often you will hear about Chiron being the wounded healer. He's wounded and he's also a healer. But I think the other part of him that's really important to emphasize there is that he has this teacher, mentor, maverick aspect of himself. He's different. He's not human, he's not animal. He's different from his people, the other centaurs. He doesn't really belong with the gods. He's kind of the quintessential edge dweller, right? He does something different. He cultivates a life that's different, gains the respect, is respected, is favored. And even in his own pain, he does something that serves others. And so I think of him with the idea of that often our pain, our original pain, the thing that has been with us perhaps since we were children, is where that's the area to work on, to find the medicine, to find perhaps our even our sense of meaning and purpose that we can bring into the world because it's needed, right? So I think one good aspect that we've seen in the last several years now is perhaps a openness to talk about, let's say, we were talking about this before we recorded, mental health, how it's seen and approached and all that. But even though there's a lot of negatives on how it's being commodified, on one hand, it's also allowing more people to come into contact to some kind of healing, to heal themselves in some way, to go to that core wound and see what is the medicine that now they can bring forth into the world in their own way. This is where I see a good aspect of our times now is that we do have to do that, because otherwise, if you look at a country, it will tend to function at its lowest denominator of showing the constant pain that is not transformed and is acting out in the world in ways that are very dangerous. It's becoming ever more dangerous. And we're seeing it. And so I think that's why I was saying in the work, the healing work you do is not just personal. It's civic. It's being a good citizen of wherever you live.
And would you have any tips for how, say, a person wanted to tap into their core wound, but they weren't sure? But you did say about childhood. Do you have any wee tips of how maybe they could sort of discover their core wound? Or
I have this idea that we don't have a lot of issues. When people say, oh, I have a lot of problems in my life, I have lots of issues. No, you don't have a lot of issues. You probably have one, maybe two. So I think it's to observe the types of experiences you have that keep repeating a pattern. The pattern is the thing. So let's say you are always finding yourself in situations where in your work, in your family, your intimate relationships, you're struggling with, let's say, trust. Or you always feel that in some ways you're betrayed, or you have a hard time. One that I saw again and again sitting with clients is boundaries, the difficulty of even knowing what a boundary is, right? Like boundaries are disrespected, your space is disrespected in some way. So those patterns that keep repeating, that you notice again and again, and in small events in your life to the bigger events in your life, that's a clue of what it is, and dig in through that. I think so that requires a little bit of taking stock of your life, and perhaps even if you like to write it down, what are some of the major events that happened, in your life from childhood till now, to see what is the repeating element here, and that's going to require to, at least in that moment, take the position of not blaming anybody or anything, but just sort of taking as much as you can, an objective view of like, okay, what is the thing that keeps, I can see it, that takes a little time,
And
but
now
I
I'm
think
seeing, now I'm seeing the wisdom in the fact of Chiron going round and hitting home when you turn 50, because you're at 50, you're maybe having a chance to see the cycles, the repeats.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I've also noticed with people around Chiron, around 48, 49, 50, sometimes there is, not always, there's a health element, a physical health element that happens, that sometimes wakes people up, right? Oh, I've got this illness, all of a sudden I got this diagnosis. And it can serve as the entry point to make a big change of seeing life differently, of approaching your life differently. So there's something usually kind of, if you ask around friends if you're younger, ask people around that age if anything happened in their lives around this time. What is it? What is the experience? What is the event that's happening? Or if you're older, if you're past this age, look back at those years and what did happen then. And maybe it doesn't have to be an event. It could be just an internal shift, right? That you can be like, oh, yeah, after that, things changed. So you can kind of start seeing as well, because I find usually that it's around this age. It's not the only one, but definitely one of the pivotal ages where you come really face to face with what is the thing that needs attention. And that's why often will come as a physical health element, because I tend to think that when it shows up in the body, it has already passed all the other layers, and it's like, I'm going to get your attention now.
True. True. I always say that it comes into the physical last, not first. It works
Yeah.
through the whole aspect of ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, so why is the edge between the personal and the collective important now? And how, in tuning into our senses of vocation and purpose, vital in these chaotic times?
Well, I think that we tend to forget that we are like microcosm of the macro. And the macro is a reflection of the quality of what's in our individual lives. You're right. So for an example, this year has been a really big year of elections. Around the world, so many countries are having elections, very prominent elections. And we think it's interesting because we tend to you can kind of see it in the discourse. We tend to think, oh, that politician, this is bad, this is good, this is bad. And almost we talk about it as if the politicians are aliens that just landed here and they, are running for office. But they are a product of the people of that country. They are a mirror to what needs to be developed in the collective of that culture, of that country. And so if we don't like it, well, that tells us there's a lot of work to be done, because they're a mirror. So I do think that here's an interesting aspect, because I notice this a lot with clients. We confuse individualism, selfishness, the sin of selfishness, with something else, which I try to tell my clients is like, selfish is not the same thing as being self-full. Individualism is not the same as individuated. And so they're very different. So we have maligned, although the culture is very individualistic, we Western culture at least, sell this idea, self-made, you go and do it, you grab it, you're the hero of your life, this constant emphasis on the individual. But it has shown a lot of its negatives, right? It can be really negative for the collective. You need a sense of cohesiveness, of community, of belonging as well. You're not just a self. But the difference is, to be selfish, you're only thinking of numero uno over here. But when you are self-full, you know who you are. You have a sense of self. You know where your growing edges are. You know where your talents and skills are. You know what you can bring to the table. But you're not, when you have more self-full, when you have a sense of self, you become less perhaps sensitive to, oh, I got to be like so and so. You become more like, no, I'm Carrie, I'm Vanessa, I can do this. I'm bringing something that's mine. I don't have to be in competition with you. This is the sort of the, if you will, the more ideal element. But to also be individuated is to have a sense of your individuality. Who are you? What are you bringing? What are your traumas? What are your wounds? Where are you healing? Where do you need to grow? You have more self-awareness of self and how you as an individual stand within the group, whatever group you're in. And so that allows you to be a much better participant, much more conscious participant within the collective. You have a sense of, we are all sort of nexus points in the fabric of society and culture. What we do has a much longer repercussion than we think. And especially if you work with people, and especially if you're doing healing work and all that, that goes a long way, right? So I think it's important to differentiate. You're not just doing it for yourself and, all about me, but it's about what I do and the healing work I do, how I care for myself, how do I like myself, how do I love myself, will have much longer legs of repercussion towards the collective. The other thing I want to say is a little bit sort of the bigger astrology is that, we may hear this, like we're in a transition period between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius, right? And if you think about it on the more, I would say, less creative side of things, when you're in Pisces, when you're in the waters of Pisces, everything is enmeshed together. It's all enmeshed. There are no boundaries, That can be really great. You can have a real spiritual experience. All of a sudden we feel the same thing. That's great. But sometimes it can create this enmeshment, this mixing that can be problematic as well. But when you go to Aquarius, it's a different vibe altogether. The vibe is, I have to be an individual within the group. And I think that's the key difference here that we're going to be working with. That what am I bringing to the table in my community? And this is going to be really even more emphasized because the planet Pluto that transform, the one that goes deep into the transformation, the one that really highlights something needs to die for something new to be born. come, mid-month now, it's going to move into Aquarius for the next 20 plus years, right? It's going to be there for a long time. So this is a real shift in the zeitgeist. And everybody's talking about the technology because Aquarius has a lot to do with technology. But the other part is the individual within the group, the citizen, the individual citizen within the collective. That's a big Aquarius aspect. So I think that's why doing our inner work is not selfish. It is not just for you. It shifts the whole dynamic. You see this in families when one person decides to do their healing work, their therapy, whatever. It changes how they interact with others. That goes changing further.
Yeah,
But
that's so true. It's
I
it's
answered the
like
question, yes.
when we do the inner work, our true inner work, we do like basically the Chiron work that you were talking about. And it's
Yeah,
then that we naturally, without thinking about it, it brings out that part of us that can be in service of others instead of in selfishness. We become that we're in service naturally when we've done the
yeah.
healing work.
We have something to offer, right?
Yeah.
And I think there are two elements here. I in the beginning of this decade, I gave a talk and I said, this is a very different decade. This is an all hands on deck decade because astrologically speaking, there's a lot of shifts, planets moving, slow moving planets moving into different signs, which tends to shift the zeitgeist. So later on in another class, I said, think of the world like a big potluck dinner. Everybody's to bring something. So if you got a bag of chips or crisps, bring it. Some people are going to bring a casserole, some people are going to bring dessert, but whatever you've got, bring it. We need it. It is all hands on deck. It isn't just for the politicians or the entrepreneurs or whatever's up there that we look up there. It's for all of us. We are nexus. We're points within the fabric of something much bigger. And that's also important. That's very Aquarius, so I think that's an element to think about, that we bring something to the table. Is it going to be perfect? No, because there's no perfection. And the more you keep going, the more it keeps becoming better what you're offering, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I felt very much the push to do this summit before we're halfway through this decade as well. I knew I want to have it completed and out there before 2025 begins. And it's interesting because at the beginning of this decade, usually on New Year's Day, we would have our family round visiting. But instead, as a family, we went for a walk together, my husband and the children. And a really strange event happened as we got out to do our hill walk to a reservoir. We started to talk to another couple in the car park, and I had walking boots on me. And all of a sudden, because they were walking boots, the laces must have caught. And before I had even taken one step of this walk, it was like they caught and I was on my knees, just like instantly, like my mouth must have been open for about 2 minutes after it, the shock of it. And I remember after this happening, and it took me a long time to get up physically and mend and be able to do the walk. But I remember really, like, I really felt like it was a message because it was New Year's Day of 2020. And I remember saying to everybody, telling them, like, whatever it is about this decade, like, we're going to be taken till our knees. It's like going to be immense. And then we were only a few months into it whenever the whole pandemic began. And, I have to say, like, everybody is going through, and I mean every soul on the planet is going through major, massive transitions and changes, and it's incredible. So the inner work never finishes either. We keep on the wave.
Well, two things that's interesting. You're thinking of the pandemic. There was that, at least the first few weeks, that pause, an absolute pause, right? You couldn't really get out. Um, you know, there was a sense of slowness. And out of that pause, I think this is a key element in our culture. We keep ourselves so busy, distracted. Distraction is an avoidance to something to rise. And all of a sudden we had to pause. We couldn't go as a normal, you know? And so things were rising to the surface out of that. There's still repercussions. People are still going through that. So the other image I like to offer to think about when we're going back to the another question you asked, like, okay, how do we get to have a sense of what is our wound, right? And I often tell clients that what you're presenting here for your healing, that you want to heal, that you want to, work on. And think about the word healing its origin comes from the idea of making something whole. That's where it comes from. You're not cured. You're making something whole. And whatever is the wound we have, whatever the issue, it makes us kind of move through life a bit wobbly, kind of little sort of kind of turned, And when you're doing the healing work, you're trying to make it more rounded, more whole, if you use that shape. So one way to think about the collective as sort of the aquifer underneath the ground, this water that feeds all these very individual wells, water wells. So you as Carrie have your own individual water well, but your water well is being fed by the deeper aquifer, the water that's under the ground. That is also being, it's with all the other water, it's the source of all the things. So whatever is the collective consciousness, as Jung would say, it's all there in that water. And if something is stirring in that water, it will push through the individual wells. So when you're doing healing work, or doing self-development, you're getting to know yourself, you're exploring your personal well, you're going down. You go through your youth, you go through your childhood, you do ancestral work, you deal with your parents, you're still kind of in that personal well. But you're also going towards the collective. But sometimes something that's happening in the collective pushes the water up your well. And then that's all of a sudden you're having an issue, if you will, but it's not just yours. It's being mixed with the collective. Something is rising from the collective. That's why I think that is the real edge. We're constantly dealing with something that's deeply personal, but what's personal is also collective. Because if you know how to do whatever is it that you're doing to healing for yourself, it's helping the collective too, because now, if you will, you're cleaning that water and sending something better towards the collective water, if you will.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does, and you definitely have a way, you have a magic about bringing them liminal spaces to us to get closer to them and to understand. Like the whole talk has just been, oh, it's a lot to digest, but in a really, really good way. Thank you. I want to thank you so, so much, Vanessa, for coming on today. And I want to say to people that Vanessa's website will be shared at the bottom of the speaker's page here. And thank you to all the listeners who have listened to us. So Vanessa shares beautiful, soulful musings and wisdom on her website, and something new might be developed for the summit launching. So make sure you check out all of Vanessa's work, which will be detailed down below. And just, it's been a really rich healing. Like, I've learned so much today from your talk. Thank you so much for being here, Vanessa.
You're welcome. I hope this inspires people to see that whatever's the thing that's bothering you, it's the issue, it's the thing. This is the entry point. This is the doorway. This is the threshold to cross and see what's on the other side, because it's going to benefit not just you and those in your immediate life, but it's really for the collective, And the last thing I'll say is the very image of the rainbow. that you used. Think about, we need all of the colors to make the rainbow, you know. So I think that's it's an interesting element, because there's our individual colors making something that's so magical, right? So I think that's kind of a good place where the individual meets the collective.
Thank you so much. That's very beautiful to finish on. Thank you, Vanessa.
You're welcome.